So apparently female athletes should be paid the same as males because gender equality, despite the fact that women's sports don't attract the ticket sales, media rights, sponsorship dollars, or merchandise sales that men's sports do. You know, the stuff that actually determines what they get paid. Or so say the male champions of change with their recently published document, Pathway to Pay Equality. And who are the male champions of change? Well, according to the report, the Male Champions of Change is a coalition of CEOs, secretaries of government departments, non-executive directors, and community leaders. The Male Champions of Change believe gender equality is one of the nation's most significant societal and economic issues. But do they really believe that? Or is that just the belief of the team that actually run the Male Champions of Change, whose staff is, surprise, surprise, 87% female? So apparently the team's belief in gender equality conveniently doesn't include their own workforce. And we should note that the 2 of 15 staff that are male, strategically located at the top of the photo, are advisors, which is to say they do sweet FA. So let's call this what it is. It's a purely feminist-driven enterprise. But we should also acknowledge the virtue-signalling males that participate in and prop up this ideological bullshit so they can reap their share of virtue tokens. And it includes the CEOs of the NRL, rugby, netball, the CEO of the Football Federation, basketball, golf, rowing, cricket, racing, and tennis. So they're all on board. Now, in this report, there's a letter to the leaders, which amongst other things states that there is a pay equity gap where men and women competing in the same sport do not receive equal pay for work of equal and comparable value. Where it is in our control to close this gap, we are committed to doing so. The first thing to remember is that whenever you see the word equity, it is code for equality of outcome. And that is what they advocate for, noting in the document that we are responding to centuries of underinvestment in women in sport, and in many cases, affirmative action is clearly warranted. Second, note the carefully crafted definition, because you see, by stating equal and comparable value, they get around the fact that women receive the same pay in tennis grand slams while being on the court for less time. As they say on page 15, the commercial value of sports is comparable to considering entertainment. It's not time in play. You don't choose which movie to watch by looking at its running time. But being feminists, of course, they can't help but contradict themselves elsewhere in the document. For example, on page 8, the principle of equal pay for equal work requires men and women to receive comparable remuneration opportunities and outcomes for doing the same work. But of course, female tennis players aren't performing the same work in terms of hours because they're spending much less time on the court, perhaps as much as 40 to 50% less time. But they're providing comparable value. But are they? I grew up watching Martina Navratilova and Chris Evert-Lloyd battle it out, and they were very entertaining to watch. But even today, women's tennis still doesn't attract the same amount of viewership that male tennis does. But that didn't stop Craig Tilley, CEO of Tennis Australia, from demonstrating his virtue credentials in this so-called case study. We've demonstrated through equal prize money and exposure that women's tennis can more than hold its own and has massive appeal. This gender-balanced and inclusive approach has resulted in overwhelmingly positive outcomes for Tennis Australia. The women's final at Australian Open 2019 achieved a domestic peak TV audience of 2.1 million with an average audience of 1.58 million, representing a 10.1% increase from 2018. What Tilley doesn't tell you is that the men's final achieved a peak audience of 2.6 million and a national average of 2.1 million, 25% more than the women. And this is where time on the court matters. More eyes for longer duration, soaking up more commercials on TV. And remember, this is a well-established female sport that's been around more than a century, and the quality of the play is high. Not as high as the men, as the Karsten Brash-Williams sisters incident showed, but still, it's a well-established, high-quality sport with a loyal following. And if female tennis brought in more money and they played 5 sets, I would say, have at it, ladies. You deserve more money. Australia has one of the top female soccer teams in the world and yet routinely gets thrashed by under-15 boys' club teams. What should we pay those boys then? Clearly they can provide a level of play of comparable value to the women. But again, if female soccer can attract more eyeballs, media rights and sponsorship, have at it. You deserve more. But pretending skill doesn't matter, which is what the male champions of virtue do, is disingenuous. The reason so many watch elite sport is because we want to watch the very best. We want to watch people do things that we can't do, that only a fraction of the population are capable of doing. I can go down to any local park on a weekend and watch the same level of play as elite women's sport by watching 15-year-old boys. Why am I going to pay $50 or $100 for a ticket to go and watch the same thing? The idea, as they say here, that there's a threshold above which fans understand those competitions as different but equal is complete nonsense. In the US, the WNBA has struggled for more than 2 decades. In this 2016 article, we learned that half of the WNBA's 12 teams lose money, and that's after the benefit from revenue generated by the NBA's national television and sponsorship deals. Does anyone think this doesn't have something to do with ability on the court? Maybe what the WNBA needs to do to attract more viewers is to have more trans women so we can see some more dunking. And the male virtue signalers also want to argue that crowd sizes don't matter. Crowd size is not the sole or even the primary factor that drives athlete pay. Revenue and athlete pay depend mainly on broadcasting and media rights. Given this financial reality, commercial success is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Investment in women's sport reflects a commercial and strategic decision that is likely to drive an increase in revenue and greater success for women's teams. Furthermore, investment in women will increase the sport's overall profile. In a crowded male sport market, investment in women's sport is likely to benefit the whole sport's commercial outcomes over the longer term. Now, just because crowd size isn't the sole or even biggest factor doesn't mean you can just dismiss it out of hand. Entry to watch women's AFL games is free just to try and get more people through the gates. If the male league did that, they'd go broke or they'd have to pay the players a hell of a lot less. Again, even when it comes to tennis, the price to get into centre court for Wimbledon to watch the men's final this year is more than 20% higher than to watch the women's final. Why? They're on separate days. They get the same coverage and the same prize money is at stake. It's because the general public is the market, and the market says they're more interested on average in men's tennis and they'll pay more to go and see it. Now, I have no objection to increased investment and promotion of women's sport. I think it's a great idea to get not only more girls, but kids in general into some kind of sport. But at some point, there has to be a commercial return on that investment to justify higher pay. And I wonder if any of these sporting codes in Australia will be willing to break out the profit and loss by gender so we can see to what extent male sports subsidise female ones. Cricket Australia would be a good example since women's salaries have more than doubled in a single year. Rita Panahi summed up this situation well on The Outsiders on Sunday.
Expecting equal pay for equal effort in sport is among the most asinine bulldust you'll see in 2019, and it's only February. But that is precisely what the Male Champions of Change Pathway to Pay Equality report recommended. And of course, it's been backed by the reliably woke heads of major sporting codes, including the AFL, NRL and the FFA. In the real world, the income of an athlete, male or female, corresponds to their marketability and profitability, and that marketability is linked directly to the viewing and purchasing habits of consumers, including women. So it's not sexism, misogyny or bias that sees the overwhelming majority of women in professional sport earn salaries well below their male counterparts. It's the fact that sports lovers, including most female sports fans, prefer the product produced by men. Do we have ridiculous reports demanding that male models be paid the same as their high-earning female colleagues? Of course not. Top male models earn nothing near what someone like Miranda Kerr or Kate Moss takes home. It's not misandry, it's just the market. The truth is, when female sports stars generate significant interest and sales, they do reap the economic benefits. Ronda Rousey, for example, was the highest paid competitor in the UFC because the fans loved her and paid to watch her compete. If you want true equality in the income earned in the sporting world, then you wouldn't stop at gender. You'd ensure that every world-class high jumper, javelin thrower and fencer was earning the same salaries as the sprinters, basketballers and the footballers. You'd make sure that sports and professional leagues that generate enormous revenue because they are popular compensate competitions where there is little public interest. If that's your idea of a socialist nirvana, then fine. But don't dress up your agenda as some brave battle against entrenched misogyny.
Of course, there won't be any call for higher pay for male models because no one cares. The pay disparity runs in the wrong direction. It doesn't fit the narrative of female oppression and therefore can be safely ignored. And that's how it should be. Female models are in much higher demand and can demand more pay. Oh, and speaking of Ronda Rousey, here's what she had to say to an Australian journalist trying to milk the victimhood angle.
Ronda, Lauren down here from the Herald Sun again. Just another quick one about Angela's question on equality just before. We've got quite a large pay dispute happening with our Australian women's soccer team at the moment. Is it frustrating for you as someone who's so prominent in your sport? And we heard you say on the Ellen show the other day you are the richest fighter in UFC, that sort of thing is still going on?
I think that how much you get paid should have something to do with how much money you bring in. I'm the highest paid fighter not because Dina and Lorenzo wanted to do something nice for the ladies. They do it because I bring in the highest numbers. They do it because I make them the most money. And I think that the money that they make should be proportionate to the money that they bring in.
Mic drop. Now, I'd like to say that sanity will prevail here in sports, but in the era of virtue signalling, I fully expect men in comfortable, well-paid positions to capitulate to the demands of feminists so they can earn more of those invaluable virtue tokens and deliver women the unearned privilege that they deserve. I'll see you next time.